I'm here to talk very briefly about appraising evidence. So today we'll be looking at critical appraisal, finding and appraising evidence. We'll be covering basics of research methodologies and an introduction to some of the core concepts of critical appraisal. Some resources online are available on the Cochrane-linked website Students for Best Evidence. So things we'll be covering today: how to find evidence using PICO as a framework, some NHS resources such as HDAS for finding databases and articles, key features of quantitative research, key features of qualitative research studies, a tiny bit about validity and reliability, and some of the biases of the research process at different stages. So hopefully after today, you'll have a better idea about optimal use of current best evidence and some of these factors. I like to say to my students, even if you see something in a peer-reviewed high-impact journal like the Daily Mail or Daily Express, why might you take it with a pinch of salt? Or why might there be problems or biases? So critical appraisal essentially is carefully and systematically examining research for three things: trustworthiness, value, and relevance. Essentially, has the research been undertaken in a way that makes the findings reliable? And can we then use the findings for our own practice, our service users, or our patients? You may remember the evidence-based medicine triad, or evidence-based practice, as clinical individual expertise, patients' ideas, values, and expectations, and best available clinical evidence. Evidence-based medicine, or evidence-based practice, is the conscientious use of all three of these. An essential step is determining the difference between quantitative and qualitative when you come across a study, so that you can best analyze or review it. Some of the key differences between quantitative and qualitative research are essentially quantitative may be more numerical or statistical, whereas qualitative usually describes or narrates a story or views or opinions or beliefs for a subjective piece of work. Going back to quantitative, it is usually more objective with deductive reasoning compared to qualitative with its inductive approach. Another core difference is quantitative relies on statistical sampling, while qualitative relies on theoretical sampling. As we go forward, this is the pyramid of evidence. You may remember that at the top of the pyramid of evidence you have secondary or appraised resources where someone has done the hard work for you. As you go further down the pyramid, you have primary studies, whether those are randomized control trials, cohort studies, case control studies, or a case series building on from a case report. Even though a case report may be at the bottom of the pyramid of evidence for quantitative studies, it still has value in that if we come across a new disease, whether it's Ebola, coronavirus, or something rare, a case report may essentially lead to a case series, which you need before you can get to randomized control trials and eventually a systematic review of best evidence. If you just remember, secondary evidence is at the top of the pyramid. A tiny bit about reliability versus validity. Reliability of a study indicates whether the results are consistent. Validity indicates whether the study satisfies objectives. Quantitative research as an overview and a generalization may have lots of selection or information biases creeping in at different points. Selection bias occurs in how subjects were chosen for a study. Information bias may be in how measurement of the disease or exposure to the disease was recorded. Similarly, measurement bias may also creep into a quantitative study. In any quantitative research, things to consider, aside from funding biases or author biases, include how was the sample size decided, any significant methodology flaws. For example, the MMR and autism vaccine quoted by Wakefield and his colleagues, or cited by Wakefield and his colleagues in 1997, had giant methodology flaws, but that didn't stop it being cited even today. Things to think about are blinding, the placebo effect, flaws in methodology, and whether the researchers have carried out intention to treat analysis. You may have heard about blinding. There is single blinding, double blinding, triple blinding, according to whether in a randomized control trial, the subjects and the control group are aware of whether they're taking or which arm of the study they're in. In single blinding, the subjects aren't aware, and double blinding, the subjects and the researchers are unaware. Triple blinding, subjects, researchers, and analysts are unaware of which arm of a randomized control trial patients fall into. Intention to treat analysis is important because wrongly looking at the patients at the end of a trial rather than the number at the beginning may give a false estimate of the precision of an effect or effectiveness of a treatment. For example, if we have a study with 50 patients at the beginning and only 40 at the end, if there's an improvement in 20 patients, if we looked at just the 40 at the end, 20 out of 40 of those patients with an improvement would give a more positive, or would suggest a treatment is more effective than if we looked at the overall group of 50. So 20 out of 50 is a smaller positive reaction or positive effect there, and that's important in intention to treat analysis, looking at the attrition or dropout rate. Similarly, the placebo effect is another thing to consider in quantitative research. Whether people are assigned to for example, a study of CBT, or whether they're given life skills in a psychology study, as an example, may affect the control group if there's still a positive effect from what they believe is happening. If we move on to qualitative research is usually used to ascertain feelings, opinions, behaviors, subject changes, or service changes. For managers, qualitative research can be important as a cheaper, cost-effective way of examining barriers, facilitators, and how best to improve a service. Some of the underlying frameworks as a generalization of qualitative research include grounded theory underpinning a lot of qualitative research, phenomenology, ethnography are two aspects or two different strands of qualitative research. Within qualitative research, you may have come across something called data saturation, whereas quantitative research relies on ideally a power calculation or a sample size calculation to adequately estimate the numbers for a significant result, or for your results to have validity. In qualitative research, although you don't need a giant group of participants, an ideal qualitative study does require data saturation when no more or no new data strands or no new concepts are arrived at. As we said before, grounded theory underpins a lot of qualitative research. Within grounded theory, or as a branch of this, thematic analysis is often used, sometimes interchangeably used as a term. Thematic analysis is pulling out strands or themes from the data from a set of qualitative results or qualitative inferences. Some of the things to bear in mind in qualitative research are: were there incentives for the participants? Does setting have a bearing? Sometimes carers or dyads of carers and patients may be more open in one setting rather than another. Were there any methodology flaws? And would a mixed methodology have been more appropriate? Another core element of qualitative research is whether there is an element of reflexivity on the part of the researchers. Have they considered their own standing or viewpoint when they're doing their research? As we move on to finding evidence underpinning critical review, another definition from Sackett and his colleagues from 1996 about why we might search for evidence. We might go to various places to look for clinical evidence, whether that's journals, biomedical databases such as PubMed, Medline, PsycInfo, or open sources or open grey literature, whether that's government reports or grey literature databases. Some of the core differences between databases as a simplification include which specialties they might look at. For example, PubMed and Medline might be the starting points for most biomedical or medical searches. PsycInfo concentrates on psychology, psychiatry. Embase is an EU equivalent of PubMed or Medline and focuses on interventions or therapies. If we look at levels of evidence again, we come back to the pyramid or hierarchy of evidence. Point of care tools such as BMJ Best Practice, UpToDate, or Dynamed are all near the top of the pyramid. Again, evidence-based guidelines, whether that's national guidelines, whether that's local guidelines, or whether that's reviews, are at the top of the pyramid of evidence. A framework for looking at finding resources on databases is PICO. For any clinical question, you can split up the research question into these four concepts of population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. I have two quick examples of how you might frame a research question using PICO. Boolean operators similarly are used on databases with or, and, as well as not as common operators. Key resource for your NHS e-resources are your Athens accounts to access local and national e-resources.